Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Shannon Stubo. I'm the VP of Corporate Communications here at LinkedIn. We are super fortunate to be joined by Brad Stone, who's a senior writer at Bloomberg Businessweek and the author of The Everything Store. And I can't tell you how fun this is for me. So I've known Brad about 15 years. For a PR person to actually get to turn the tables on a reporter and ask him questions is like complete nirvana for me. So I'm really excited about today. And I have a very hard-hitting interview prepared.
And of course, the history of Amazon, Shannon knows well because for years she worked at eBay.
That's how Brad and I met.
So saw all of this unfold from the other side of the aisle, so to speak.
I definitely did. So let's start there. So tell us a little bit about your history with Amazon. How'd you get interested in writing this book?
I started covering technology in the late 90s for Newsweek magazine, and I was based in New York at the time, but would come to the Bay Area and to Seattle to visit the companies that were starting to change our world, and one of those companies was Amazon. I started covering the company probably in about 2000 when the whole foundation under the company was crumbling, along with the dot-com bust. And I actually remember one of my first visits to Amazon's headquarters. It was in an old hospital at the time. The Nisqually earthquake in Seattle had just hit, and you couldn't go in through the front door. You had to go in through the back, and there was a sign warning of falling bricks. And it was like a perfect metaphor for Amazon at the time because the stock price had gone from 110 to 7. And there was, Jeff Bezos bunkered down in his conference room with his crazy laugh, claiming that, they were going to survive. And it was sort of I think that might have been my first experience meeting him in person. And then over the course of many years, from Newsweek to the New York Times, now to Bloomberg Businessweek, got to talk to him quite a bit more and saw the incredible story unfold.
So one thing I'd love to know is how do you actually pronounce, is it Bezos or Bezos?
Well, if my book accomplishes anything, it'll be to get people to pronounce correctly the name of this, one of the wealthiest and most successful people in the world, and it's Bezos.
It is.
And in fact, I'm doing all sorts of interviews now on TV and radio where the name is mispronounced, and I'm kind of gently correcting.
So we should all know, coming out of this room, it's Bezos.
Yes.
Jeff Bezos.
That's how he pronounces it.
Okay, that's probably a good indicator. Did Jeff Bezos talk to you for the book?
So I went to speak to him when I knew I was going to write it, and we have a pretty good relationship, and but I knew that his sort of reflexive response to many authors over the years that have wanted to tell the story is that it's too early to tell the Amazon story, which is sort of incredible when you think about it, considering it's been 20 years and already an incredible story. He ended up opening many doors. He allowed me to talk to family and friends and actually many senior Amazon execs. And then I drew from my probably dozen or so interviews with him over the years. But in terms of the kind of reflection that, say, Walter Isaacson got from Steve Jobs, Bezos is far too secretive for that. He competes in some tough competitive categories where your perspective is your competitive advantage and rivals copy you quickly, so he's a little bit too circumspect for that.
So it's a really long book. You've got a lot of content in there.
Is that a criticism?
No, not at all. It's a perfectly sized book. How many people, you talked to, I think you said 300 people, so give us a sampling of the types of people that he introduced you to and then people that you kind of found on your own.
He didn't introduce me to anyone, but I would ask, can I speak to your parents? Jackie and Mike, who were really the first Amazon investors, and run the Bezos Family Foundation. Some high school friends. I didn't ask him for permission in a lot of cases, but he inspires so much loyalty among the people around him that they would turn around and ask, "Is it okay to talk to this guy?" And as far as I know, he always said yes. And then a smattering of Amazon senior executives, which to me was thrilling because the company is so secretive and Bezos is the figurehead, and really, if they don't make many other executives available. So guys like Jeff Wilke, who fixed Amazon's huge fulfillment center network and has been with the company since 1999 and now runs the retail business, and Diego Piacentini, who came from Apple, and Andy Jassy, who started at fresh out of business school at Amazon in 1997 and now runs the cloud business, Amazon Web Services.
So you mentioned his parents, and you had a bit of a scoop in the book that has gotten a lot of press. Do you want to tell our audience a
Sure.
little bit about your scoop and how you found it?
And kind of taking a step back, it's just so remarkable to me that so many of our political and business and cultural leaders have unusual circumstances around their early lives. And in the case of Jeff, he had always been open about never knowing his biological father. And I just, as I set out to do this, I thought, this is someone who has changed the world, and you want to find out kind of where they come from. And that story had never been told. And as I started to do a bit of research, I found out that this man who had left his life when he was only 3 years old was, of all the crazy things, a unicycle performer, which is just, you can't make that up. And if you remember that, Jeff, was like inseparable with his Segway for a couple of years. And so I was like, is there some genetic predisposition to wield vehicles? So long story short, I decided that I would go track him down, and I found him running a bike shop outside of Phoenix. And to my surprise, he had lost track of the family and had no idea that this man was one of the wealthiest men in the world and was running Amazon. He was, he didn't actually know if his biological son was alive or dead, and actually had really regretted he was, I think, 18 at the time when Jeff was born, and had spent his whole life regretting that outcome. Wow.
Will you forever be known as the man that broke this story to Mr. Jorgensen?
For him, I will, probably.
And maybe the rest of us, too. Okay, so after all the research and all the interviews, who is Jeff Bezos? Like, tell us who he is in a few words, and is he different as a man than he is as a CEO?
I just think he's one of the rare people in this world who, are both, the entrepreneur, then the innovator, the guy who starts the company and has the vision, and then the operator, the guy capable of running, 19 years later, a company with 90,000 employees, unimaginable complexity in its operations, far more than Apple or Google, because for every additional 10,000 or 10 million customers, Amazon has to get incredibly more complex in terms of it, where it's storing and how it's shipping products, and so he's the entrepreneur, he's the operator, he's been incredibly successful at both, and then on top of that, he's got this drive and vision to do other things outside of his core responsibilities. So he's building a spaceship company called Blue Origin. He went and acquired the Washington Post. And he's got these sort of science fiction-y interests. He's building this clock to measure the pace of time over thousands of years. And so that fits in too. He's sort of a dreamer.
And what do you think he's going to do with the Washington Post?
So I would love to say that in August, when my book was at the printer, that I had anticipated that purchase. But I was very surprised, as was almost everyone in the media world. And now we know that the Graham family was looking for a buyer, and talked to Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay. And so I think the opportunity was presented to Jeff, and he's a big reader. One of the lessons of my book, I think, is that Amazon is a learning company and a reading company, and there's an appendix with some of the biggest books that underlie their most important decisions. He reads newspapers every morning. He's built an editorial business, with the Kindle for authors. And it distinguishes Amazon, I think, from Google and Apple, in that they really are betting on content creators. And so I think he's going to, bring his incredible resources and long-term orientation and, operating discipline to trying to revive the franchise. And who knows, maybe one day using it in a way that, creates something that's distinguished for the Kindle ecosystem.
So one of the things you wrote about, speaking of the written word, is that they open each meeting at Amazon. Everyone has to do a quiet read of a 6-page narrative.
Don't you guys do that here at LinkedIn?
We do not,
okay.
Thankfully. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I think that'd be interesting
Sure.
for us, given how many meetings we all go to.
Sure. So about in 2003, as Amazon is getting a lot more complex in its internal operations and starting to add employees again after a period of retrenchment, Jeff is very unhappy with the way the company is scaling. It's actually around this time that there's another resolution that they're going to take the IT operations and split them off into what he called 2 pizza teams. So to lessen coordination and kind of have these groups working in tandem very independently. But he's also unhappy with how meetings are conducted, and he feels that PowerPoint in particular kind of can conceal lazy thinking. And and it's a waste of his time. One of his incredible talents is actually just time management. I mean, it has to be to do all these things, and innovating against his own schedule. And this is almost the first example of that. It's as I said, he's a huge reader. Authors have talked about seeing their copies of their books that Jeff has read, and they're marked up and annotated every page. So he's like really digesting these books in an incredible way. So anyways, he decrees. First he says that instead of, we're scrapping PowerPoints, he hates it. And we're going to...
The whole company.
The whole company. And of course everyone's groaning. We're going to go to these documents. You're going to write down your thoughts, and we're going to start by reading them. And then we'll we'll be able to conduct a more thoughtful discussion. And first there's no page limit to the narratives.
Oh, I thought it was 6, sorry.
Well, no, there is. At first, there's no page limit.
Okay.
So immediately you've got like term paper length papers at Amazon and like engineers feeling like they're back in high school English. Lots of torment. And this is also a time when like Amazon share price is languishing. People are just unhappy, and nobody thinks this is going to stick. And then subsequently 6-page limit, appendix for data, and it's how he prefers to process information, and it's one of the reasons why I describe Amazon as kind of scaffolding built around his brain. Yeah, because it's very tailored to how he thinks and how he processes information, and as a result, how all of the people that have chosen to stay at Amazon and at this very idiosyncratic company, how they now process information. It's also actually been very interesting to watch people who have left try to bring narratives to other companies, and it often doesn't work. I heard Groupon, which is now almost entirely former Amazon execs, tried to do it, and it didn't stick.
So one of the places he wasn't particularly verbose is when he gets an email from a customer. His email address is public, jeff@amazon.com, if anyone
Everybody
shoot
email
him a
him.
note.
No.
And if he gets something from a customer that he has a question about, he forwards it to somebody with just a plain question mark, and panic ensues. What is that about?
Right. Well, actually, it's much like what we just discussed. I think part of it is also time management. You can think of nothing more economical than a single piece of punctuation. But basically what he's doing is, Amazon's a very data-driven organization, right? Their weekly meetings, the metrics meetings, they're poring over huge spreadsheets of data to figure out what's working, what's not, where there's room for improvement. But at the same time, kind of paradoxically, they're monitoring customer feedback. And they're allowing their customer in a way to kind of audit the organization and to find defects. Amazon, this incredibly complex company, is constantly looking to root out defects and improve efficiencies because in some respects it's a retailer. It's a discount retailer, and discount retailers are built upon organizations with very low cost structure. So rooting out defects is core to what they do. And customer complains, and if Jeff gets it, or if the customer service department forwards it to Jeff, he'll forward it along to the relevant executive, probably much like you do in your department, with just a question mark. And yet it's everybody at Amazon has a question mark, they're called escalation stories, because you get that in your inbox and it's like a ticking bomb. Like you cancel your plans, you probably dive under the table, and you basically have a couple of hours to fix the problem or to explain why it happened, and the explanation then gets elevated within the organization to Jeff's office. And it's one of the reasons why there's probably a tremendous amount of pressure at people who work at Amazon, because even though it's a huge organization, very diversified, and Jeff spends most of his time on the newer businesses like the Kindle, it's a way that he efficiently supervises and audits the entire organization.
I love the fact that he innovates against his own schedule. I mean, that's very impressive, time management.
And probably, something that we can all learn from. But it's one of the things, like when you heard he bought the Washington Post, it's like, honestly, how does he do this? Yeah.
So you describe the culture as idiosyncratic, and culture and values is something we take really seriously at LinkedIn. a lot of people that work at Amazon don't actually love working at Amazon. And I don't think that they strive to be on list of the 50 best places to work. That's not how they feel about culture and values, it seems like. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that culture is? How would they represent it externally and internally?
Well, I can describe how I kind of represent it in the book, and actually I haven't gotten much pushback on it. I mean, I do think there's a variety of experiences at Amazon, and maybe there are departments where life is comfortable and you go home at 5 and you don't work at night, and that probably depends on who your boss is. But by and large, from interviewing many people, was described to me quite often as an adversarial culture. In one memorable description, a gladiator culture. And it's very purposeful. And Amazon's values are posted on its webpage, and one of them is, I think it's disagree and commit. And in the description, and of course you can see Jeff's fingerprints over all these values, he's talking about how a lot of companies favor what he calls social cohesion, which is sort of like people's natural inclination to be agreeable and friendly and civil to their colleagues, and he doesn't want that. He wants, because they're truth seekers, another phrase of his, and to get to the truth, you need to bounce competing views against each other and have it out and have the debate. And it's not always pleasant or comfortable. And he has memorably said to his colleagues that he never wants Amazon to be a country club or a place where people kind of can coast in their careers. It's tough for a reason. And going back to the fundamentals of the business, they're in a tough business, low margins, lots of competitors, aggressively expanding all the time. So while the culture makes it a tough place to work, it's probably also part of the reason why, almost alone among all that first generation of internet companies, Amazon has kind of continued to thrive and expand.
Do they have a cafeteria? That's
they
what
do.
We really want to know.
They do, but it's not free.
It's not free.
All right, and then that's.
Is it subsidized?
I don't even think it's subsidized.
Okay.
And that's.
We should all be so grateful. Yeah. That's why I'm.
And that is, that's Jeff reading Sam Walton's autobiography in the '90s and realizing, and meeting Jim Sinegal at Costco and beginning to understand that discount retailers, just have to push every cost out of the system. I mean, Amazon's criticized for giving, very little in terms of charitable giving. And that's, it's all part of the same kind of culture. And there's a good side of that culture for customers in the form of low prices, but it can be uncomfortable for kind of the other constituencies.
Someone I know that worked there said if you take a candidate who you're interviewing to lunch, it's not expensable.
Right.
That's not considered something that is work-related if you decide to take someone off campus for
lunch,
which I found very fascinating.
I had dinner with an Amazon executive while I was researching the book, and I knew he was going to do this, and they all do this, and they're modeling Jeff behavior, but he graciously picks up the tag at the end, the bill at the end, and then tears it up and says, the company's not paying for this, I am. And it's something they all say, and it's something that every time, and of course I have never been on Jeff's private plane, sadly, but every time...
He does have a private plane.
Yeah, of course, and every time anyone takes a ride on the plane, he'll say quite purposefully, the company's not paying for this, I am.
So he seems to have generated quite a bit of loyalty, despite being somewhat of a tough personality. Where does that come from? Being
right, being being a founder, right? Founders have
just naturally,
credibility. They were there at the beginning. It was him in a garage. Being early to see the opportunity of the internet, and then sticking it out during the low point when really a lot of his senior management team left. It was Jeff against the world, and a lot of these decisions, to open up the product pages to other retailers, none of his organization thought that, very few people in his organization thought that was a good idea. Because, you're running the toy category, and you buy all this inventory, and you've got, the Pokemons in the warehouse that you're responsible for. And Jeff says, we're opening up the product pages to better compete with eBay, and we're going to allow other retailers to come in and sell against you. Terribly uncomfortable decision inside Amazon. But it was the right call. It worked out, and the marketplace business is half of Amazon's, retail revenue right now. And, it's being right and being kind of, proven as a visionary just buys you a lot of credibility and a lot of loyalty. and even when your standards are uncomfortably high.
And he's a ruthless competitor. I mean, if you look at their M&A strategy, they essentially go by their competitors, right? And you talk a little bit about the Blue Nile example, which I'd love you to share with the group. But how does that, if you're a competitor of Jeff Bezos, see that? Yep. What do you look out for?
There are so many good stories. Blue Nile being, actually they really have never overtaken Blue Nile, but they were kind of timing their announcements in the jewelry category to Blue Nile's press releases. But even later on, they get even more clever. With Diapers.com being the best example of just undercutting them on price. Ultimately like bringing them into a meeting, the founders of Quidsy, and then announcing Amazon Mom while they're in the meeting. And gutting the profitability of the whole category. But while we can criticize Amazon for its ruthlessness in that example, I think the lessons there are clear, which is, if you're going to start an e-commerce business, make sure you're differentiated. Don't start it in Amazon's backyard with a commodity product that, where you're basically kind of trying to out Amazon at its own game. I mean, Quidsy was building a great brand with Diapers.com, but ultimately they were vulnerable because a package of diapers is a package of diapers. Whereas more recently, we've actually seen a flowering of innovation in the e-commerce category. I think with a lot of companies taking the lessons of Zappos and Diapers.com and doing things that have a more competitive advantage, figuring out new models or certain kinds of products that are unique, that maybe with manufacturers who don't want to sell on Amazon because it's a discounter. Very much the way, the Valley viewed Microsoft in the 90s or Google, today. Any entrepreneur and any investor who's getting into the markets that Amazon competes in is going to think very carefully about what they're going to do and whether Amazon's going to target them.
So we were fortunate enough to have Tony Hsieh here a couple years ago from Zappos after the acquisition. And I definitely got the sense that they're allowed to operate pretty independently, even though they were acquired by Amazon. How did they get to do that? Because it looks like the rest of the companies have been really well integrated, and Tony Hsieh and Zappos have been able to stay sort of separate.
That's absolutely true. Amazon went a little nuts with its acquisitions in the 90s, as we all remember. Just company after company, they were growing like wild. They needed experienced executives. Capital was free. They bought, they went on a spree and bought a dozen or more companies, and nothing worked out, and all the executives left, and it was kind of a disaster. And over the next 6 or 7 years after that, they bought nothing. In a time frame when Google bought, YouTube, Amazon just stuck to its knitting in Seattle and decided that they were going to build everything themselves. And Zappos there were a couple examples like Joyo, the Chinese internet company, but by and large, nothing. And Zappos was really the first acquisition after this long dormant period, and they had nearly kind of achieved breakaway velocity, $1 billion in revenue. They were also done in by some of the same mistakes as diapers in terms of a product category that didn't quite have a competitive moat around it. They were also raising a lot of debt to run their operations at a time when the recession and the financial crisis hit. But nevertheless, Amazon was kind of just getting back into acquisitions, and it's funny. I mean, they haven't allowed that kind of autonomy, and maybe they are a learning organization. They also paid stock for that deal, and at a time when Amazon stock went through the roof, so the acquisition ended up being perhaps larger than they wanted, and they haven't been paying stock since then either. So it's interesting to see the ways in which Amazon learns from previous experiences.
Can you talk a little bit about the engineering culture at Amazon and how Jeff interacts with that group? It's a huge piece of their business, right? 90,000 employees. How many are engineers?
Well, there's a big chunk of that will be the fulfillment center workers, and in terms of the actual engineers, I mean, we've thought of Amazon for a long time as a retailer, and now it is obviously has proven its bona fides as a technology company, and of course with web services in particular has spawned a whole new era of innovation here in Silicon Valley. I imagine the life of the engineer at Amazon to be a difficult one. In fact, until recently, and maybe still, they actually carry pagers.
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 Remember pagers?
And you know, now I assume a lot of that is built into their mobile phones, but there are different emergency levels for crises, from Sev 1 to Sev 5. And I think it's the Sev 1 that's the most dramatic, and you drop everything you're doing and run to fix the problem. It's tough. Now, I do think that they have really solved a lot of the fundamental technical challenges of their operation. You know, like so many of those early internet companies, you know, eBay too, you know, things just broke down after a while. No one had ever built their operations for, you know, the growth of the internet was so unanticipated. And until Amazon got to a service-oriented architecture, and that was, you know, a multi-year bloody mess, you know, things were difficult. And in fact, there's a famous web posting by a former Amazon engineer named Steve Yegge. I don't know if any of you remember this, but he inadvertently made it public on Google Plus about 2 years ago, and now he's at Google. But the exact quote is something like, "I have a hard time thinking or talking about Amazon without wanting to puke." And it was from, you know, he worked during that difficult transition as an engineer, trying to shore up and fix the infrastructure, and it wasn't easy and it wasn't pleasant.
So Amazon Web Services is not something that gets a lot of publicity. I mean, that's sort of the behind the scenes thing. Why do you think they decided that was something they wanted to do when it came to filling out the portfolio of business?
I tell the story of Amazon Web Services in the book, and it is one of the more remarkable business transformations, I think, in history. You know, how does a retailer, you know, an online retailer spawn an enterprise services company that subsequently ends up kind of changing the world, and maybe even in some ways sparking the Web 2.0 boom. And now we know the CIA is going to start running its operations on Amazon servers. So you know, the short version of the longer story is that, you know, Jeff was really frustrated in about 2004, 2005 with this transition to a different architecture, that the consignment of servers for testing inside Amazon was very constrained and unified. So if you were an engineer at Amazon and you wanted to test anything, you had to go to this kind of high priesthood that controlled all the resources. And he said, you know, why is this a bottleneck? Why do I have people coming in with their documents, their narratives, and talking about, you know, personalization features they want to roll out, but they've been unable to test them? And it spawns this fresh thinking about how do you create services for developers that can kind of solve the bottleneck and unleash creativity. And back to my point about books inspiring innovation at Amazon, he had read a book by a video game developer named Steve Grand, who an artificial intelligence researcher who created the game. It was called Cohesion. And Grand in his book talks about how, you know, to inspire creativity and create artificial life, you need to create building blocks, or what he calls primitives, and let the alchemy kind of take over from there. And one of the great, amazing things that Bezos does is like transplant ideas into totally different contexts. And so around the discussion about testing, he said, you know, what we really needed to do for developers is create building blocks or primitives. Let's not try to control what they're doing, but we'll unleash their creativity by just giving them very basic tools. And they start brainstorming primitives and their storage and compute and payments. And that is the genesis of what we now know of as Amazon Web Services.
You mentioned Sam Walton, too. Is that someone Bezos admires? And they looked a lot at Walmart when building Amazon. What were some of the lessons they took from an offline retailer?
Sure. I mean, you can go back to Amazon's values posted on the website, and you see two that are drawn right from Walton's book. One is frugality, which we've talked a little bit about. You know, the fact that if you're going to provide low prices, you can't spend inside your organization. And then the second one is what Walton called a bias for action, and that's basically kind of, you know, empowering any employee to fix defects within the organization and to try new things. And bias for action, you know, from Walton is an Amazon value. And then more generally, you know, in 1998, in 1999, when Amazon's hitting this growth curve, they start hiring people from Walmart. In fact, there was a poaching lawsuit about it at the time. And you know, one of those executives ended up staying and having quite an impact. He was the CIO But a lot of them left. They kind of came to Seattle and saw these kids running around, didn't quite understand what Amazon was doing. But it was an interesting kind of cultural transplant into Amazon at a very formative time.
Why do you think he's never moved the company to Silicon Valley? I mean, they don't even have an office here, right? Except AWS is in the city, but Amazon.com doesn't really have a presence. Is that intentional?
Actually, Amazon's expanding everywhere right now, and they've got Lab 126 in Sunnyvale and Cupertino, so the hardware's here, and they're invisible, but they kind of are everywhere. It's funny, they've got their music is in San Francisco. But you're right in that, Seattle's the headquarters, and it's a little unusual. But very early on, as he's driving west from Wall Street, he, starts to research mail order businesses and realize, that they are not required to collect sales tax except in the states where they're located.
So that was the primary driver.
Well, it was a very strategic reason to stay out of California or New York or Texas, the country's most populous states, and Washington's populous, but less so. It was also near a major book distributor, Ingram's, and he had some friends there. And look, I mean, Amazon this is now not, it wasn't part of the calculus, but I think it's been fortuitous for them that they're in Seattle. If they were in Silicon Valley during the low period when the stock is going nowhere and Google is rising up and all the social networks are rising up, I think the churn could have been crushing. But because they're in Seattle, because Microsoft at the time is perhaps not the most inspiring place to work, they were protected from some of that.
I'd like to ask you, before we open it up to other people who want to ask questions, as a much younger company than Amazon, what can we learn from Jeff Bezos and Amazon.com?
I think the fact that it's constantly a learning organization is something that any company could benefit from. The fact that they read, that they get together in book groups. Not that you all need kind of homework or more time at work, more things to do. But I found that interesting and kind of inspiring that they're in some ways humble and like know that there are a lot of outside ideas that they could benefit from. And we'll read books that are kind of far outside the purview of business, and then learn from that and take things that inspire big decisions. So that's one. They do sometimes strain credulity as they claim to be so customer focused, but it is true. Like there are plenty of examples of companies that sort of punish their customers. I've been flying a lot, and like you walk into a United plane and they're blaring a commercial at you over the loudspeaker. And Amazon, for all of its faults and for the way in which it can kind of be ruthless and pursue competitors and strong-arm partners, they really are remarkably customer-focused. That you see all sorts of examples of how they'll bypass revenue opportunities because it's simply, on a bad customer experience. And
one of the constituents that he hasn't paid that much attention to over time are investors. For a long time, he was invisible on earnings calls, right? He still is. He doesn't participate. So what is that? Where does that ethos? Where does that come from? I think that it's his unwillingness to play the Wall Street game. To manage the company. It has worked out. Yeah, to manage the company for quarterly results, because he knows that actually managing the company for quarterly results can be at odds with successful long-term performance. And he wants to make long-term bets, that pay off in 5 to 7 years, that might hurt the bottom line. And I wasn't going to list that as a lesson because not everybody can get away with that, right? I mean, there would be an outcry, if Marissa decided that she was going to take a pass on Yahoo results. But there's a credibility that comes from being right, from operating with discipline, from hitting your targets every quarter, even when you lose money. If you've projected that it's a growth period and that a loss is possible, and Amazon investors don't get scared. And I think his invisibility, on the earnings call, as with so many other things that he does, is just strategic. He's alerting investors, his long-term institutional shareholders, that he's not going to play that game. And it's one of the reasons why
they're so loyal. And even when Amazon loses money, the stock price goes up. And in fact, they're reporting today. So we'll see
what do
if
you
that.
think they're going to announce? We'd love to hear it here first.
I don't, it almost doesn't matter, right? I mean, is it a small loss or is it a small gain? They're not going to make a lot of money, but they're going to show a remarkable another quarterly growth in revenues that's well outpacing traditional retail or even e-commerce, which shows that once again they're taking market share away from their competitors. And if there is going to be a crisis in confidence in Amazon, it's still a long ways off.
Okay, that's a great place for us to open it up to questions. Microphone's right here in the middle. Daniel, you're going to be first? Okay.
So Shannon alluded to the acquisition of Zappos, and I think of both Amazon and Zappos as two companies that have done an incredible job of putting customers first. But from an internal culture perspective, they seem almost at opposite ends, right? Zappos being the warm, fuzzy, you make employees warm and fuzzy and happy, versus Bezos having more of a reputation of kind of you criticize people and rule by fear. How has that been working?
Well, I think, to the point that Shannon made earlier, and maybe this is a factor I left off, but Zappos was able to maintain this incredible autonomy. And so I think that the cultures just haven't meshed. I don't think, Amazon-style frugality, have invaded Zappos at all. I toured Zappos' offices and talked to Tony and other members of the Zappos management team, and it's incredible how much independence they have. And they moved the whole company to the old downtown Las Vegas and moved into town hall, and it's in some ways extravagant. Zappos, now we don't know what their internal finances are, but it wasn't never all that profitable to begin with, and probably because fundamentally it is such a good customer experience. You can buy 10 pairs of shoes and send back the 9 that don't fit. It's expensive to operate. And from Amazon's perspective, they took out a key competitor who was kind of carving out some of the shelves in the everything store, and now they have Zappos in their own backyard. So while it may not be a huge positive in terms of profit, it certainly is no longer a competitive threat.
But he sanctions the subculture, which is kind of neat. It's a culture he would never have in the headquarters is perfectly okay.
That's right, and he has actually said, that that the two different cultures can live happily together.
Some of that may come from the fact too that he's got respect and confidence in Tony, right?
Or is willing to be patient for the day when the current Zappos management departs, and then they do start to change Zappos. It's possible.
Brad knows better than I do.
Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone's uttered the words Stephen Jobs, and I suspect that even the founders of Google suffer less from mispronunciation of their names than Jeff Bezos.
Good job.
Thanks. My point being that there's a lot of people who have been, maybe equally or less successful than Jeff Bezos, but are much more visible. Why do you think it is that he gets so little play? Or maybe I'm just reading the wrong media.
I think that's beginning to change. I think now he is held in the same esteem of Jobs and the Google founders. I think for years it was let's review the history. In the late '90s, he was celebrated, right? He was Time Man of the Year. You couldn't get him out of the press.
Person of the Year.
Person of the Year. Sorry, you couldn't get him out of the press, and it was always Amazon.com, and he was branding the company ubiquitous. And then in about 2001, he's getting beat up a lot. Amazon stock is in the single digits. He was actually even accused falsely of insider trading. There was like an SEC investigation into some of his automatic stock transactions. He's in the New York Times associated with an SEC investigation, and he's piñata. And around that time, he stops being less available. And I don't know if that's war wounds or there's really no reason anymore to go in the press and take his licks. And so for many years, he becomes less visible. And now over the last few years, it's just very strategic. When he's got a new Kindle or a new Kindle Fire, or a new initiative like frustration-free packaging, he'll do interviews. He is very visible. But I don't think he finds it as enjoyable anymore, or really there's any reason in terms of branding the company, because people now know what Amazon is.
I could just quickly follow up. There's a lot of talk about Steve Jobs and what would happen, what would happen to Apple if and when he left. What do you think would happen if Jeff Bezos left?
I think actually it's probably one of the most critical issues facing the long-term success of the company. And if you're a shareholder, that's a nervous day. And it may not be anytime soon because he's about to turn 50, and my impression, is that he will run this for many decades. But the company is so diversified now, you wonder if there is really anyone else as versatile to run.
And there's no one internally pegged as an heir apparent.
I hadn't heard, I haven't heard much about succession planning at Amazon, but there are some natural candidates. And Jeff Wilke, who I mentioned before, runs the big part of the organization now fairly autonomously, I think, the retail business, and Andy Jassy is running Amazon Web Services, and he's been at Amazon forever. So there are some candidates, but it's hard. It really is, Jeff Bezos' company, and very tailored and tuned to his style of leadership.
Why and how do you think Amazon is able to keep a lot of their projects very safe and secure as a secret? And you never hear about a surprise product left at South Lake Union Bar in Seattle. Right? So.
That's a great question. How is Amazon able to operate with such secrecy and discipline? I was actually very proud in my book to have an internal Bezos memo, this memo he wrote called Amazon.love, about him kind of thinking aloud about how the company can be loved and not feared when it gets to Walmart size. And I think it might be the first memo ever to leak out of Amazon.
I don't think I've ever seen one.
As opposed to, I don't think there's ever been a memo written at Yahoo that hasn't leaked. I don't know. But, how do they do it? Like so many things about Amazon, just like rigorous discipline. And it must be, kind of pounded into employees during orientation. And, they're not fooling around. And, as a journalist, I see it when even if I'm at a conference and I'll introduce myself to an Amazon employee or executive, and the sort of flicker of fear in their eyes, if I'm about to start tweeting the pleasantries of the small talk. They are, I think there's an allergy to the press and a discipline with memos and things, and they're just very effective at, kind of making sure that their efforts are secret.
Cool. Hey, Brad. So my name is Kai. I joined from before LinkedIn. I actually worked at Amazon.
Awesome.
Wow.
So I read your cover on Business Week and the follow-up on articles about their performance management process, their acquisition of diapers. So I'm surprised to see that you actually know more about Amazon than most people who work there. So I just want to actually circle back to earlier question where Shannon asked about the culture at Amazon is very tough. And the culture of frugality may not be popular among everyone working there. So that may have caused a lot of turnover. But Amazon has grown a lot. How do you think that? Do you think that may have had any positive impact and positively affected their growth of Amazon?
Are you asking, has the culture kind of softened? Has the company's been required to grow and hire aggressively?
I'm saying the rapid change of personnel and
Right.
The turnovers within the company. Obviously, turnover is not a good thing, but in the context of Amazon, do you think that may have positively affected their growth?
I think that so much of the culture emanates from the top,
Yeah.
From Jeff. And then, the senior leadership team has actually remained fairly stable, and they're all reflecting Jeff's way of thinking, and have internalized his a lot of his mannerisms. And so I think actually it's probably remained a fairly stable culture. Maybe softened somewhat as it's grown, but as with all things, they're very good at what they do, and they're very good at recruiting. And you wonder, because it's a difficult place to work, would they hit a wall at some point, particularly when there's so many more, attractive workplaces, as alternatives here, particularly in Silicon Valley. But, they are doing a great job at recruiting. And I heard a stat recently in Chicago that something like 100 new Amazon employees a day are coming to the city. which is incredible.
In Chicago?
Could that be? No, in Seattle.
Oh, in Seattle.
Yeah, yeah.
You heard it in Chicago.
No, I heard it in Seattle. I don't know what I'm saying.
Okay.
Yeah.
You're in
I don't know
Mountain View
where
right
am I
now.
right now. But you know, and they're recruiting a lot in Canada, and obviously in Waterloo, where Research in Motion is in trouble. And you know, and because the stock price is going up, it remains, despite the fact that it could be challenging, you know, a very attractive place to work.
So as you were describing this incredibly wealthy mogul who's moving into the publication industry, I was thinking of no one less than Citizen Kane in terms of the mystery surrounding this man. And I was wondering, based on your interviews and everything you've learned, what's driving this guy? You know, what's his rosebud?
Interesting.
Great question. I wish I had asked that.
You know what? I'll respond this way. What he would say is, you know, to create an enduring company, you know, very customer focused, you know, that outlasts him and everybody that's working at Amazon. And what his critics might say is to be the wealthiest man in the world, running the largest company in the world, and the smartest guy in the room. And what I would say after working on this for 2 years and studying it, as with all things Amazon, an incredibly complex company, and Jeff Bezos, an incredibly complex guy, it's a little bit of both. You know, he is building an extraordinary customer-focused company whose growth is unchecked, that has enormous leeway from investors. And at the same time, when we look at his behavior in the marketplace, and even, you know, innovations and services today that they're rolling out in direct competition with Apple and Google and doing all these creative things to kind of circumvent these you know, better capitalized competitors, like you can tell that that's the mission too. It's not just the everything store, it's the everything company.
Thanks.
Hi, Brad. I am chatting with a bunch of our employees who couldn't make it in the room today, so I have some questions for you. The first one is about employee retention. Do you have any insight into what employee retention is like at Amazon? And if it's high, do you have any insight into why that might be?
I don't know what the specific numbers are. In fact, I don't even trust the external numbers because the company is growing at such a rapid pace. And then you also have to consider the fulfillment centers that are hiring many temporary workers for the holidays, and then a certain percentage of those leave naturally because demand's going to go way down in January. All I sort of know is kind of anecdotal, and I would guess that churn is slightly higher than competing technology companies, maybe not a lot, and particularly since Amazon stock has done so well, and there are big incentives for employees to stay. And I've talked to my share anecdotally. I've talked to my share of employees who lasted 6 months and went screaming out of there. And then also, I've talked to executives who worked at Amazon for 10 years and who had enough and left, and 2 years later went back because they, found that they weren't as effective anywhere else, and that they actually really missed the culture and missed the performance and the atmosphere. So it's hard to, somewhere in Amazon Human Resources, there's the answer to that question, and I don't know it.
I'm curious, Amazon has done a great job embracing the disruption of its own business. If you look at Kindle and ebooks, the Prime Instant Video, what about the company enables them to hang together and really say, like, we're willing to let go of this big part of our business and take a risk on this new thing and embrace it and really stay ahead of things as the world's changing around them?
Absolutely. It goes back to something I was saying before, which is, Jeff's pursuit of the truth and creating a culture of truth seekers. And so the Kindle is just a great example of a very data-driven company that's looking at their numbers every week and seeing at around 2003, 2004 that their CD business is evaporating because Apple, with the iPod and iTunes, has created a digital revolution in music. And Jeff extrapolates to see that this kind of transformation is very possible in other parts of the media world. And he knows that books is the core original Amazon franchise. And he says, we've got to do this ourselves in books, or somebody else is going to beat us to it. And it could be Apple or it could be Google. But if we lose books, we're in trouble. And at the same time, another book they've all read is The Innovator's Dilemma by Clay Christensen. And
Another speaker that we had.
yep, and they know that that kind of transformation is hard, and you basically have to go and kill your own business. But he says to an Amazon executive, Steve Kessel, who's running the physical media business, I'm taking away all your employees, all your direct reports, I'm taking away your job, and you're going off on your own, and your job is to kill your old business. I want you to put your old colleagues out of a job. And it sounds brutal, but it was kind of necessary at the time. And the result, 3 years later, is the Kindle business and a product and service that ends up kind of changing the way the world reads.
Do they do company meetings?
They have 2 all-hands meetings that are held in the Coliseum in Seattle.
2 a year?
A year.
Okay.
Yeah.
We do them every other week. So I'm just trying
Well,
to
different
sort of
scale.
calibrate. Yeah,
yeah,
90,000?
Yeah.
Okay. Mav?
So we talked a lot about Amazon and Jeff, obviously, but I'm interested to know a little bit more about you and why you chose to write about Amazon and Jeff, and what's next for you.
Thank you for the question.
He's going back to work.
Finally, a question about me.
We have another half hour on you, by the way.
Actually, why I decided to write the book was sort of, I just saw the opportunity. There have been, over the course of the last few years, some great Apple books. There have been some great Google books. There was a great Facebook book, and a movie. And around the time when the Walter Isaacson book about Steve Jobs was coming out, and of course there was tremendous interest, I really thought, there have been some Amazon books, but I felt like no one had really cracked the story or given us a kind of, deeply reported journalistic account of Jeff Bezos. And and I covered the company for a long time, so I felt that it was a good domain. And then at the same time, book publishers were going to bed and waking up thinking about Amazon, because this is their biggest distributor and increasingly their largest competitor, because Amazon's getting into publishing. And so I knew that there would be interest as well. So it was frankly the opportunity. And
is your book available on Amazon.com?
It is, and at your friendly local neighborhood bookstore.
And on your chairs too.
Yes. Yeah. And then for me, at this point, I going back to my day job, Bloomberg Business Week, which I now have a fairly large debt to repay in terms of the time that they have given me to pursue this.
That's great. So, one more? Okay, we have time for one more.
This is a nice time since you mentioned the word bookstore. Did Jeff Bezos have anything to say about Borders? Because they had a love-hate relationship with Borders over the course of time. And personally, as a grad student, I grew up with Borders, and I partly had Amazon to blame when Borders went under. But at the same time, I love Amazon too. So they're doing a lot of good things for publishers. But at the same time, what are they doing to bookstores? And did he have anything to say about?
He doesn't really. Very rarely addresses the competition. But what I'll say is actually Borders to me, and I tell the story in the book, is a great example of a company that kind of ignored the truth, right? We've talked about truth seeking. And Borders, was running its business, in direct competition with Barnes & Noble for many years, locating massive growth, always locating stores near the competition. And the internet comes along, and they get Amazon to run their operations, to run their website for 5 years. And so they never develop any expertise in the core growth category. And Barnes & Noble, you can criticize for being a little late to the ebook phenomenon, but actually they were too early. They invested in Rocketbook, a digital reader in the 90s, and that was too early. And so their problem was they had seen it fail. So when the Kindle started coming, they thought, we'll see if it's real this time, and then we'll move quickly, and it turned into a key 2-year disadvantage. But at least the Rigios, who run Barnes & Noble, were watching this. I never got any indication that Borders saw that disruption coming, and they didn't. They weren't moving and evolving with their customers or with the internet. So I know it's easy, and I probably sometimes do it as well, to kind of lay the carcass of Borders at Amazon's door. But honestly, I don't think it was all that well run of a company.
Okay. No more questions from the stream, Jill? Okay. Great. So I want to thank Brad so much. He's going to be here for a little bit if you guys want him to sign your book. His mom, Carol, joined us today, too. She's in the front row. And thanks to all of you for making the time.